Good everyone. On behalf of the Athena Lab board, welcome Admiral James Stavridis, who will join us this morning on the webinar. He has many friends in Chile, we remember, and are very happy to have him. It's an honor to have a noted person in military, business world, and private world. Admiral Stavridis has an extensive curriculum. Among many things, he has been commander-in-chief of the NATO organization, also commander-in-chief of South Command. Thus, he knows very well the Southern Hemisphere and the Americas, among others. Today, he is a high executive of the Carlyle Group, and also in the academic sense, he has been a dean of law and diplomacy of Tufts University. He has been a commander of a destroyer, a strategist, a thinker, business consultant, and specifically a seaman, whom he will always remind us, specifically in his books. So for us at Athena Labs, he is a source of permanent inspiration. We always follow his publishings, and we are very happy for his support. Even the preface he wrote for the book we published last year, specifically about upon armed forces in the Western Hemisphere for the next decade, or which has already started and has invited us to sail as the same society in the Americas. Next, Admiral Stavridis will give a brief presentation that you will be able to follow along. There you will be able to follow along with simultaneous interpretation in Spanish as we are talking, or directly here at the bottom globe where you have the channels for the language. And then after this, we will have our question and answer round with John Griffiths, and we will open questions for the audience as time allows us to do so. So, Admiral, he says you have the con.
Very good. Nice use of nautical terminology. Well, thank you, everybody. It is an honor to be with everyone in Chile, a country very close to my heart. I have visited many times. I've been from the very south to the very north of Chile, and so many times in and around the beautiful center of the country, Santiago, Viña del Mar, such a beautiful place. Secondly, I want to congratulate Athena Labs on approaching their third year. And I remember vividly the conversations about founding this wonderful institution. I think it's a vital one for Chile. I'm very happy to see it involved not only in the maritime space, but also in global security and touching business and very broad topics of geopolitics. So what I've been asked to do this morning is to say a word about a new book that I've written. It's my 10th book, but it is my first novel, my first work of fiction. And the title, as you can see, is 2034, as in the year 2034, a novel of the next world war. It is about the idea that in 2034, what would it look like if the United States and China ended up in a war? And God forbid that happens. And if and when you read the book, you will see the outcome is very bad for both countries. I get the question a lot, Admiral, why did you write a novel about the future? And the answer is, I wrote about the future because I was thinking about the past. And specifically, I was thinking about Cold War times, US-Soviet times. And there was a rich body of literature, of films and books, Dr. Strangelove, The Bedford Incident, Failsafe, Red Storm Rising. All of these books, I think, allowed us to imagine how terrible it would be if we ended up in a global war between the two superpowers of those days, the US and the Soviet Union. So come back to the present, and as I began to think about the past, I realized there was no comparable body of literature today that could help us imagine what a war with China would look like. And I thought it would become important to tell that story in fiction, because if we can imagine a disaster, we can often avoid it. Here are two disasters that happened to my country, neither of which were we clever enough to imagine. We couldn't imagine the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor. We couldn't imagine that a group of terrorists from Afghanistan, of all places, could bring down the World Trade Towers. More recently, all of us failed to truly imagine a global pandemic. So this failure of imagination, I think, is what I sought to change by telling the story of a war with China, not to predict that conflict, but to warn, to create a cautionary story so that we could come back to the present and avoid it. So with that, I will very quickly sketch out the basis of this conflict, much of which is well known to an audience in Chile, which of course follows events very closely in the Pacific, has an enormous trading partner in China. You understand this well, so I will sketch this very quickly. China's strategy is clever. It's geopolitical, geoeconomic, and it has the idea to create finished goods and export them along these routes, both sea and land, and then to bring raw materials back to the factories of China. Along those routes, you create influence, you create geopolitical influence. And of course, it's not simply what's shown here, it's also China's efforts in Africa, in Latin America, Central America, and elsewhere around the world. It's a smart, long-term strategy. It creates points of disagreement between the United States and China. So upper left, cyber is one distinct area of disagreement. A second, upper right, is the idea of our navies colliding, particularly in the South China Sea. Bottom left, China is building artificial islands throughout the South China Sea and claiming larger and larger expanses of that very vast body of water. And bottom right, you see trade and tariff disagreements. And in the center, technology, disagreements over who will control the spectrum, who will lead in microchips, who will win the race to artificial intelligence. So China has a strategy, which I showed a moment ago, of exporting, importing, creating geopolitical influence. And as a result, it creates disagreements, competitions, and hopefully not actual military conflict. I mentioned in particular the South China Sea. Chileans are mariners. They understand the oceans very well. You realize how vast, how big this South China Sea is. It's half of the continental United States. And China claims much of it. And to consolidate that claim, they are building artificial islands, as I mentioned. Their navy is growing. It may surprise you to know today China has 360 warships. The United States has only 300. Now, our ships are bigger. More of them are nuclear powered. Our subsurface, submarine capabilities are vastly better. We are still in a dominant maritime position. But the fact that Chinese numbers of ships are rising is an important strategic point for the United States to understand. I mentioned cyber a moment ago. We see increasing levels of Chinese interference in our cyber. And of course, the United States has strong offensive cyber capability as well. This is a back and forth battle, much as it is between the US and Russia. But it is increasingly a fundamental part of Chinese strategy. I mentioned the competition about the 5G networks led by the Chinese company Huawei. There is competition for various levels of technology, particularly quantum computing, artificial intelligence, Over time, these two will merge with the internet as we understand it, and control over that will become an increasingly area of disagreement between the two nations. There are also disagreements about human rights. Upper left, you see the administrator of Hong Kong, a woman named Carrie Lam. You may remember, upper right, the so-called umbrella revolution, which occurred over the past 3 or 4 years ago, when 2/3 of the population of Hong Kong, 3 out of 5 million people, turned out in the streets with umbrellas to protest Chinese crackdown. This became a flashpoint, and over time, China has consolidated its control over Hong Kong, somewhat in disagreement with the agreement that was made with the authorities in the United Kingdom when the former Crown Colony was returned to China. So human rights are a significant concern, even more so in the bottom image, in the treatment of the Uyghur population. These are Muslims. They're from a different ethnic and religious part of the Chinese population. They are being treated in ways that many in the international community see as significant violations of human rights. So this issue of human rights, alongside cyber, alongside military competition, alongside the South China Sea, all of that will be a basis for real competition. And again, hopefully not military conflict, but the spark could exist there. Taiwan, of course, is another important part of this. Taiwan is a big island. Sometimes in the United States, people think of it as, a small country. It has a population well over 20 million, probably close to 25 million. It has the economy by itself of Taiwan is ranked about 30 in the world. So this is a very significant entity. The Chinese view it as a rogue province. There are a small number of nations that recognize its independence. The United States does not, but the United States does not wish to see Taiwan forcibly brought back into China proper. So there is a significant level of disagreement about Taiwan alongside the other things I have mentioned. We also are watching closely the way China and Russia come closer and closer together. The largest military exercise since the end of the Cold War was conducted in Siberia 3 years ago. It was between Chinese and Russian forces, and bottom left, you see them hugging each other at the end of these exercises. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of aircraft and tanks. This was an enormous land set of military exercises designed to show the cooperation between China and Russia. And of course, this occurs at sea as well. Bottom right, you see a Chinese frigate and a Russian destroyer operating together, not in the North Pacific, where you might expect that. That photograph was taken in the Baltic Sea, in the heart of Europe. So these two nations are drawing closer and closer together, two authoritarian states who have a vested interest in pushing back on the ideals and ideas of Western democracy. We also are very observant of the way China and Iran are drawing closer and closer together. And in the novel 2034, China's allies are Russia and Iran. And Iran continues to see itself not as a limited regional power, but very much a global power. You see Iranian warships deployed all around the world. In fact, that photograph I showed you a moment ago in the Baltic Sea, just several weeks ago, Iranian frigates are operating in the Baltic Sea. They are transiting the Atlantic to bring weapons to Venezuela. We see Iran very much views itself as an imperial power and is drawing closer to China. India. India plays a very interesting role in the novel, neither aligned fully with China nor with the United States. I think that is very realistic in terms of how India will see itself in this century. This, by the way, is the Golden Temple of Amritsar. It is sacred to the Sikh faith. I put it here to remind us that India is an ancient civilization. It is a vast population. It will overtake China as the world's most populous nation in the middle of this decade. It's a democracy, a somewhat messy democracy. But at the end of the day, the United States and the West need to think coherently about how to align more closely, in my view, with India if we are going to avoid the events of 2034. So with that, let me wrap up by introducing you to some of the key characters of the novel, in case you haven't had a chance to read it. The first one you meet in the book is an American naval officer named Sarah Hunt. She is a Commodore in charge of 3 destroyers. We would call that a flotilla, small flotilla. And she is driving her destroyers through the South China Sea on a freedom of navigation patrol designed to say to China, these are international waters, these are high seas. Sarah Hunt, the Commodore, sees a vessel in distress. She goes to render aid. And by the end of the afternoon, in the first few pages of the book, all 3 of her ships are sunk and at the bottom of the South China Sea. She survives, along with a handful of her sailors, and reappears in the novel as it unfolds. But this incident begins the novel, and then suddenly the reader will find himself or herself flying a Joint Strike Fighter on the edge of Iranian airspace. It's being flown by Major Chris, call sign Wedge Mitchell. He's like in Top Gun, think Maverick or Goose or Iceman. Wedge is a pure fighter pilot. Unfortunately for him, his control of the aircraft is taken over. The aircraft is forced to land in Iran, and waiting for him on the airport is Brigadier General Qasim Farshad, an Iranian 1-star, very much like General Soleimani, who interrogates Wedge. Does not go well for our pilot. And then you cut to the 3rd opening scene, and you meet the Chinese Admiral, Lin Bao. Admiral Lin Bao, as the novel opens, is in Washington, D.C. He's the defense attaché of China, posted to the United States. And he's at the gates of the White House to deliver an important message, which is China is tired of the United States in the South China Sea, and that these 2 incidents are linked together. And Admiral Lin Bao delivers that message to the final character I'll introduce you to on the right here, Dr. Sandy Chaudhuri, who is Indian American, but an American citizen, 1st-generation Indian American. He is working in the White House as a deputy national security advisor. He receives this message from Lin Bao. Everything I've described occurs in the first 30 pages of the book. The story then begins of a conflict that is not to the advantage of either nation. It ends up badly, although I will give you what we call in American English a spoiler alert. At the end of the novel, the world does not end. This is not the apocalypse, but all of the nations that are in this are diminished, particularly the United States and China. And in the end, that is the message of the book, is that there are no winners in a war, particularly one with a nuclear exchange. I'll close with this. It's a photograph taken from an old Cold War movie, Dr. Strangelove. And the story in Dr. Strangelove is of an American failure to control its nuclear forces, leading to an inadvertent attack on the Soviet Union. On the right, you see the American president, played by the movie star Peter Sellers, and he's trying to explain to the Russian president, the Soviet leader on the left, why all these American bombers are headed into Russian airspace. It's a moment about miscalculation, about regret, about failure of leadership. That's what we must avoid. And therefore, the novel is a cautionary tale. It is a warning of what we must avoid as we go forward. Well, with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and I would love to open it up for some comments or questions. And I believe my dear friend, John Griffiths, will start us off.
Okay.
Gracias, Almirante,
Thank you, Admiral, for your presentation. John will cover a bit more leadership, which you also have been writing deeply about, and we'll ask a bit about the novel, because it is a fascinating book that I recommend. Italy, since it was published in March, we began reading it and can't stop. It is a true warning on what could all go bad. So, in this sense, I wanted to ask on an eventual conflict between China and the US that you write about, what is the most riskiest? It is the miscalculation, constant friction. We always have US forces sometimes with support with European allies for freedom of sail or into areas that China claim as their own, and China answers back by complaint. But we see at the end of the day another British patrol group that also go into the Chinese, and the warnings again. What is the riskiest aspect? The miscalculations, the constant friction, and how these two giants can find a way to live in way of such importance for the world.
The question is exactly the right one to ask. And I think it is both. It is the constant friction of disagreements over cyber, over military interactions, over the South China Sea, over human rights, over alliances with nations with whom the US disagrees, like Russia and Iran. So that constant friction is a base. And in fact, think of it as kind of like a pool of gasoline. That pool of gasoline only needs a spark, a miscalculation. And I'll give you an example from history. Go back to 1914, Europe. We all know this tragedy very, very well, of course. Here you have the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, Imperial Kaisers Germany, France, the United Kingdom. All of their economies are intertwined. The royal families are related to each other. The Kaiser is the grandson of Queen Victoria. Yet, in August of 1914, that pool of gasoline had a spark. And the spark was an assassination in Sarajevo, a small, dusty town in a corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. How did that turn out? Well, 4 years later, 20 million dead, Austro-Hungarian Empire, gone, Russian Empire, gone, the Ottoman Empire, gone, all of it. Europe is up in flames. So China and the United States are a pool of gasoline, and the spark that could hit it, in my view, is less Taiwan. Others think it might be Taiwan. You can make an argument about that. But I think it is more the South China Sea. It's the disagreement over who owns the South China Sea. China believes effectively it owns much of that territory. The United States disagrees with that strongly, believes it's international high seas. That's why the British are there, the French, the Germans, the Australians, the Japanese, all of these nations are conducting these freedom of navigation patrols. So unfortunately, I'm worried. Now, I'll close by saying more important than any of that is how do we avoid it? How do we avoid a war between the US and China? And I think the answer is we reduce the day-to-day friction wherever we can. We have individual dialogues on our disagreements on cyber, our disagreements on human rights. We use the international courts to adjudicate the South China Sea. We take a measured approach in how we speak about each other. So we reduce friction wherever we can in trade and tariffs, for example. We ensure that US firms have reasonable access to Chinese markets if Chinese firms want to have access to the United States. Perhaps we have free trade in certain zones and areas. So we reduce friction wherever we can, Juan Pablo, and we avoid the spark. So the way to avoid the spark, to conclude, is training, interaction, inviting the Chinese to participate in RIMPAC, something the Chilean Navy participates in every year. We ought to include China in that. We ought to have hotlines so we can pick up a phone and call from the Chief of Naval Operations of the United States to his equivalent in Beijing, for the president to be able to pick up the ultimate hotline and speak to President Xi. Those don't exist. That would be a pretty good place to start on reducing the miscalculation. So bottom line, you need to reduce the tensions and you need to avoid the spark. Both are dangerous. That's why the book 2034 begins with that match hitting the pool of gasoline in the South China Sea.
Perfecto. Gracias, Almirante.
Perfectly. Thank you, Admiral. I ask, India, you give it a protagonistic role. But here, honestly, several countries talk of Indo Pacific concepts: the US, Australia, Japan, the UN, the European Union in a whole, but Latin America still has a debate there, and some sectors are still using the Indo-Pacific concept. Indo-Pacific concept. Would you recommend them to alter the geopolitical influences of the time?
Well, first of all, as always, decisions about strategy and military activity and alliances are for the people of the individual nations. So these are decisions for Chileans, these are decisions for Brazilians, these are decisions for Argentinians. From a US perspective, we are emphasizing, as you point out, what we call the Quad, like a foursome, the Quad. And the Quad is the United States, Japan, Australia, India. I think that is an important alignment. It is not an alliance, big difference. It's not a military alliance. It's an alignment between those four nations who are in agreement that they can work together in positive ways to create better security throughout the Indo-Pacific. I think it is a very open agreement. From a US perspective, the US would love to see European nations come and participate in exercises with the Quad. We would love to see Latin American nations, particularly those with significant naval capabilities like Chile, participate. Again, those are individual decisions. We're always happy to see, we, the United States, always happy to see the Chilean Navy in RIMPAC, for example. And as you know, we've seen significant command authorities given to Chilean senior officers in the RIMPAC operation. Whether Chile would like to take another step, participate in exercises further out into the Pacific, time will tell. But certainly from a US perspective, I can say that it would be most welcome.
La última pregunta en mi
The last
turno.
question on my turn before going to John. In your book, you let it known excessive cult to technology by the armed forces, the specific cases of the naval. What seaman skills, basic skills, should never be lost, as even though we have so much technology available at our hands, radar, sonar, GPS technologies.
Yes, this is another theme that is very central to the book, is that technology in a military setting is very powerful, to include radar, sonar, GPS, missiles, all of it is powerful, communications and cyber especially. But we should recognize that our opponents will seek to mitigate, to negate, to stop those technologies. And in the novel, you see China with very strong cyber capabilities, who then becomes able, in an expression we use in the book, to blind the elephant, to blind the elephant, meaning you can stop a very powerful force if, in the case of this image, the elephant can't see where to go, doesn't see what is attacking it. It is rendered harmless. So the point is, we need to use our technology and be capable of utilizing it in every instance. But we also need to recognize our opponents will seek to undermine that. And therefore, we need a plan B, plan Bravo. And so I'll give you a practical example. When I graduated from the US Naval Academy, approximately 1 million years ago, a very long time ago, we used sextants, the device that allows you to look at the stars and the sun and the moon and tell you where you are. All you need is a sextant, a paper, a pencil, and an almanac, and you can tell where you are in the world. By the time I was a ship captain 20 years ago for the first time, we didn't use a sextant. I don't think I saw a sextant in 3 years as captain of a destroyer, my first tour. You may or may not find that surprising, but we relied completely on GPS and electronics. Today, at the Naval Academy, they are again teaching the use of the sextant for exactly these reasons. And so the message of 2034 is, yes, all of that exquisite technology is highly useful, but you better have a plan B in case you lose control of it.
Muchas gracias. John.
Thank you. John? Thank you, Juan Pablo. Admiral, thank you very much for your presentation, and we hope to soon have you present with, also have you with more freedom of thought present with us, and to make of use of what you've presented in your book, like, for example, Sailing True North, another book of, or Leader's Bookshelf, where you refer clearly towards military leadership. What, in your judgment today, would be the main characteristics of this leadership that is needed to manage high uncertainty scenarios, disruptive uncertain scenarios, like you point out specifically in 2034, or how in reality we are seeing the effects of the pandemic and how our military leaders react? What's, according to your judgment, be central aspects that would have highest relevance?
What an excellent question for our times. And let me start by saying great leaders are innovators. They are unafraid of change. Now, that does not mean they spend 100% of their time constantly thinking about what is the next big thing. But I would say a good leader spends about 1/4 or 1/3 of his or her time consciously thinking about innovation. And today, as we grapple with the pandemic, we see innovation emerging all around us in the world of biology. We see also, because of the pandemic, innovation in education. What we are doing right now, we probably wouldn't have tried to do 2 years ago. We would have waited for me to get on an airplane and come to Chile, and it would be much nicer because I could drink a great Carmenere with all my friends. But this is a powerful tool, and we should use it. So innovation in education, innovation in the world of business is all around us. Now, in the military context, it means the following. Our senior leaders should be saying to themselves every day, how do I use cyber more securely? How do I use unmanned vehicles more capably? What are the ways in which I can use special forces, particularly elite special forces, in my operations? The US Marine Corps, for example, is very innovative in thinking through how Marine special forces, we call them recon, like reconnaissance, recon Marines. How do we use these particular Marines? They're like Navy SEALs or Army Green Berets. So special forces is another area. Hypersonic cruise missiles, so kinetic weapons that move multiple times the speed of sound. Maritime. All of the ones I just mentioned have maritime components, but how do you translate those to operations at sea? And then finally, we need to think very coherently as military leaders about protecting our communications, our command and control networks. So there's a defensive side to this. Just as with cyber, there's an offensive side. So I think military leaders need to think constantly about innovation, using about 1/4 to 1/3 of their time. Secondly, I think military leaders need to spend, again, about 1/3 of their time on communication, on ensuring that the communication circuits are protected, that they are moving the correct operational signals, of course, but also the right messages of inspiration and leadership to their team, to their sailors and their soldiers. So I think communication is a second significant characteristic for all of our leaders. And here I include, John, the idea of reading, of being a consumer of ideas, of reading books on leadership and geopolitics in the world today, books and articles such as are produced by Athena. I think that's part of communications, broadly speaking, and a good leader is spending about 1/3 of his or her time on those kinds of activities. And then third and finally, I think that good leaders focus on building teams, on building capable teams. And here, I mean, this is the realm of operations. And whether you are the captain of a diesel submarine, like my good friend, Commander Christopher Green of the Chilean Navy, who just finished 2 years in Newport, Rhode Island at our Naval War College, he's coming back to Chile to command a naval diesel submarine. I'm very proud of Christopher. As a leader, what he needs to do in his small command, his diesel, is to build teams. What the big admirals who run the Navy need to do is build coherent teams to ensure there's collaboration. I think that's the third essential task of a leader. So innovation, communication, and collaboration or team building, I think, are the three elements. And I'll finish, John, by saying all of that has to rest on a base, on a bedrock, we would say, of values. Our values are democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of education, gender equality, racial equality. We execute those values imperfectly, but they are the right values. And I think good leaders begin with that base, and then they use some combination of what I have spoken about in order to be the best leader that they can.
Muchas gracias, Almirante.
Thank you, Admiral. Well, my second question related to the previous one. If leaders, commanders, and people in charge have to be innovators and improve communications, facilitate team building, what measures be adopted by the services of the Army, Navy, Marines, the people in charge of cyberspace or defense to facilitate effective leadership to alleviate the 21st century's challenge? Like also pointed out in the novel, in such a complex time of competition between great powers, what can institutions do to facilitate more effective leadership?
At the very highest level, we should be evaluating our officers, our senior enlisted leaders. And today we evaluate them on their ship handling skills or their capability flying an aircraft or how well they can navigate or their ability to inspire others. And those are all good measures. But in addition to those kinds of metrics, we should be consciously evaluating our leaders, particularly as they become more senior in their approach to innovation. What new ideas has this officer come up with? Is she someone who thinks out of the box? That ought to be a metric. We ought to measure that. We ought to include it in her performance evaluation. So I think first and foremost, as always, is finding the right people who are willing to innovate. Secondly, all of our organizations, big ones, in my view, should have what I will call an innovation cell, a small group of people, perhaps in the case of the Chief of Naval Operations, I would say a small group of perhaps 5 officers, maybe 1 senior chief petty officer, handpicked among the most innovative across the age spectrum, maybe a very young person, a very senior person, but this small group, give them a small amount of money that they can use as leverage, as seed corn, and give them the ability to walk all across the organization, find the good ideas, even outside the organization. Tell them, go talk to business, go talk to the legal profession, go talk to everyone involved in a big business, get the good ideas, bring them back, put them in this innovation cell, because hierarchies, bureaucracies have a tendency to kind of crush new ideas. So if you have a small cell that reports directly to the top, that can be a very effective way to generate new and good ideas. And then third and finally, it is tapping into organizations like Athena, like think tanks around the world, monitoring the literature. So many brilliant ideas are out there in open source publications that can be discussed and brought into conversations. So I think the way you do that is, for example, at the Athena Lab, is there a military representative who is sent there for a year as a fellow who can help curate, look at all of these big ideas, bring them back to the military? tapping into expertise outside of the organization in that way is vital. If you do all those things right, John, I think you then have a better chance when the bureaucracy sits down to construct, for example, its budget. It will be with a filter that says, well, maybe we ought to be thinking more about cyber, unmanned, special forces, maritime capabilities, all the things I just mentioned. So there's no single answer, no silver bullet. This is a long way of saying you have to build a culture that respects innovation, that moves it forward, even as you still, of course, have to have the main bureaucracy that executes the ideas.
Gracias, almirante. Nos queda tiempo, me da la impresión.
Thank you, Admiral. We have time, I think, still for a final question. To your judgment, how do you observe the current geopolitical relationship that exists, which is always a complex relation that requires good approach, specifically after the last tensions we've seen internationally, and where particularly in the last change of US presidents, there was a type of tension in that. How do you observe the political military relation, and what can you tell us about that?
Thank you. First of all, I want to make a point, which is that I am neither a Republican nor a Democrat. I am a registered independent, always have been. I am a centrist and a believer in the political center in the United States. And so I mention that because I will say this about the Trump administration. They did some things that I agree with. They put pressure on the Islamic State. They put pressure on Iran. They put, I thought, a reasonable idea forward for coming to the table with North Korea. It did not work, but I think it was the right decision to try and have a direct dialogue with North Korea. Trump administration did many things that I thought were effective. They did some things that I thought were ineffective. One of which was the way in which they did not fully respect or integrate with our allies. I feel as though the Trump administration pushed away at NATO. They pushed very hard on Japan and South Korea about shared military costs. And it's reasonable to have conversations about shared military spending and so forth. But I don't feel like the Trump administration effectively tended to the garden of our allies, partners, and friends. They were much more America first. That was the campaign slogan. Now with the Biden administration has done some things I disagree with. I disagree with pulling the final few thousand troops out of Afghanistan. I think that's a mistake. I disagree with some of the policies on the US border, which I think have led to a lack of control of the US southern border. But what I strongly agree with that the Biden administration is doing is working closely with our allies, partners, and friends. And I think that is a key advantage for the United States as we enter an era of competition with China. So I think that means, as we have talked about, working closely with our traditional military partners, NATO in Europe, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Singapore, and others in the Pacific. And here in the Americas, it means working closely in a geopolitical sense with those nations with whom we have the highest degree of shared values and operational experience. Obviously, Chile would be at the top of that list. I would say Colombia is also a very strong ally, partner, friend of the United States. I think we have strong relationships in other parts, but principally, I would say with Chile and with Colombia, we have a very strong alignment. And I think that's a pretty good basis for the United States as we look to this world to the south to continue building. And by the way, I like the Pacific aspect of this. We'll have to watch closely what happens in Peru, which has been at times a very close partner, other times less of a partner. We'll see with the new president there. I am hopeful that he will take a pragmatic approach. We'll see. And the rest of the region as well as I do, the complexities of it all. But from a US perspective, I think you'll see a strong focus on our relationships both in Chile and Colombia. We always have to have a strong relationship with Mexico. That's going to be difficult. There are some fundamental disagreements between the countries. We'll work through those. But I think here in the Americas, as I look to the South, those would be the two relationships that will be strong. And so pulling back the lens and looking at the world, I think you'll see this Biden administration want to work with allies, partners, and friends in the way I've described. And then finally, John, and I know we're running out of time, I think the Biden administration will work closely with international institutions. Look for them, obviously, to re-enter the climate discussions, which they have done, which is smart, but also to use the United Nations, to work with the IMF, to work with the World Bank, to work with the OAS. I think these will be the kind of things that this administration will do very, very effectively. And so bottom line, I think the future for US-Chilean relationships, as always, are very strong. And I want to conclude by saying, during my time as the commander of US Southern Command, I deeply enjoyed every interaction with your Navy and your nation and all of the armed forces, and remain very, very good friends with many in Chile. I look forward to my next visit, and I want to close my remarks by saying simply thank you for including me. I look forward to coming back to Chile soon.
Muchas gracias, Almirante, como
Thank you,
siempre.
Admiral. As always, it's a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to talk with you, and we value and appreciate your willingness, your thoughts and ideas. So I leave you with Juan Pablo, our Executive Director, so that he can close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. If you have time for several more questions, we have many, to be honest, but we know you're a busy, busy man. And among them, we have someone who knows you, Admiral Julio Leiva. He's Chief Commander of the Navy, Admiral Leiva, whom you met. He says peace is possible and war avoidable when there's a balance of strength and fear of wholesale destruction. So we lose more than what is worth. How do you see in the future this balance of power in the future? What would be the role of Africa, Europe, South America in this?
I will close with these comments because I do have a call scheduled at 10:30, and my job as chairman of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. But for my dear friend Julio, I'm glad to give a very quick answer, and he and I will explore this in more depth, I'm sure, in the years to come as our friendship continues. Julio, I would say that we can avoid war. What is important here is that the US and China continue the dialogue at every level. And here, I think every nation can play a role in ensuring that we don't force nations to make choices between the United States and China. We need to find the zones of cooperation between the US and China. Climate, preparing for the next pandemic, working together on medical diplomacy, humanitarian and disaster relief. Include China in RIMPAC, as I said a moment ago. Build hotlines so we can communicate. We will have plenty of areas of disagreement, But if we focus on zones of cooperation, I think we can build a better world and avoid conflict. With that, I will say muchas gracias por su tiempo, and I look forward to seeing everybody in Chile in the near future. Thank you so much. I salute my friends in the Chilean Navy.
Gracias, Almirante. Lo esperamos y gracias nuevamente. Muy invitado a Chile. Que tenga buen día.
Thank you very much, and we will continue to follow along with what the Admiral has to tell us more about, and we invite you to a future activity. So with this, we thank you very much. This wish you the best day, and thank you very much.